Hello, class. It's Dr. Hardin again, and this is the continuation from the last video of Conflict and Congregational course that we're taking. This one's entitled Surrendering to Your Limits, and we're continuing to work through Peter Scazzero's book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Big idea. Believe it or not, you are not invincible. I know that may come as a shock to some of you, but take a deep breath and just bear with me. We'll get through this lecture together. Here's another tidbit of information. You're going to become frustrated and stymied in your growth if you stubbornly refuse to accept God's loving limits that He places on you. You are not bulletproof, and it doesn't take as much as kryptonite to set you back. And so in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about limits, how to accept and grieve through them, and how to flourish through them, frankly. So that's kind of where we're going. You see, you've heard this every lecture so far. You cannot separate spiritual maturity from emotional maturity. And acknowledging and accepting personal limitations is a sign of emotional maturity. Therefore, acknowledging and accepting personal limitations is also a sign of spiritual maturity. Now, as we come to realize that we're not Superman or Supergirl, it can be quite difficult on us. We have to learn to grieve that loss and to deal with those limitations that God places on us properly if we're going to continue to grow. Now remember, if you don't grow, you're going to get stuck. And if you're stuck, your congregation will not grow either. And the less mature you are as a leader, the less mature your flock will be, and the less mature groups of individuals are, the more conflict seems to grow. So this all ties back to being able to help lead your church through the waters of conflict. So to do that, we've got to grow spiritually and emotionally, which are tied together, and then we've also got to learn to grieve the loss of limitations in getting there. Okay. How do we do that? Well, one thing we've got to do, and this ties back to a previous lecture where I talked about, recognize, regulate, and respond. But we've got to pay attention. We've got to recognize that there are certain things we're limited in. If I wanted to be a star quarterback in the National Football League, I don't think that's going to happen. Now, call me crazy, and I've seen some pretty bad quarterback play, but that's not going to happen. And for me to not be aware of that fact is downright foolish on one hand, but it shows that there are people out there that believe those kind of things. And so we have to pay attention that this limitation that has been placed upon us is ultimately for our redemptive good. I often think that even how we use our language is so important. An individual comes to me and let's say he says it's a young man, and he talks about being under stress. When I hear the term stress, it sounds like an external force pressing in on a person, a mechanical, kinetic force of some sort pushing in on a person. And that may be how it's experienced, but what happens when you change the word stress to say, I'm under trial? Well, now you understand the pressure you feel is still there, but you see it from a different perspective. You see it from a perspective of a test. In other words, someone's placing me through something for a reason. So now all of a sudden there's meaning and purpose to this difficulty I'm experiencing. But if I do not pay attention to the limitations I've been given, I won't even get to that point. I won't recognize that's happening. So part of grieving properly, those limitations that you may have, deals with paying attention to them instead of repressing and pushing them down. Another thing to deal with them properly is just waiting in the confusing in-between. I sure wish that certain things could be done for me much quicker than they are, more quickly, if you will. But they don't. And so I have to be able to trust God that He knows best, and that He'll bring me to a certain point at a certain time when He wants me to get there. Now, that doesn't alleviate me of responsibility of moving toward Him. But sometimes the answers, it's all in your time frame perspective. And we have to be able to wait in the confusing in-between. We also need to learn to just embrace the gift of limits. I'm getting to that age in life where I know that certain ships have sailed for me. I'm never going to have time in my life, what's left, to go to medical school. If I chose to do that, I'd have to go back and get an undergraduate degree in chemistry or biology, and then medical school. And by the time I got out, I'd be 75 or 80 years old. Not going to happen. That's okay, though. God's placed me in a different ministry, doing a different thing with different people, and that's okay. So you got to learn to embrace those gifts that God puts on you. Another one in our personal walk of my wife and I, our family, I've shared this with you before, but our son, our youngest son, at the time of this recording's 13 years of age, be 14 very soon, and he's severe autism, and he needs 24-hour care, and my wife and I have to be those primary caregivers. We cannot go to Kenya on a mission trip for 12 or 14 days. Impossible. But that's okay. God provided a mission field in the next room here. So embracing those gift of limits is really a key to grieving properly the losses like that you experience in this world. Another one is learning to climb the ladder of humility. We're going to get into this in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But there are certain levels of humility, and as you climb up on those levels, what you'll notice is it seems like the higher you climb on the ladder of humility, the more deeply your connection with Jesus Christ becomes. And we'll get into that in just a second. That's part of learning to accept or grieve these losses properly. And another one is it's just the patience to let the old birth the new in God's timing. All things shall come to pass, and just be patient with it. So with that said, with how to grieve properly, let's go back to the ladder of humility, and let's look at that for a moment. Well, rung one. As you start climbing this ladder, you will begin developing this fear of God and a mindfulness of Him. Like I mentioned before, you will start thinking of stress with other terms like trial. I told you in another lecture, I believe another lecture I have before, Bob Kellerman has always said that when life stinks, our God perspective shrinks. And I think that as you start this climb up this ladder of humility, you'll realize that God is there. And as Francis Schaeffer would say, He has spoken. But we're more mindful of His presence as we start to climb. Brings us to rung two. At rung two, we become more comfortable pleasing God instead of pleasing ourselves or others. Not my will, but Thy will be done, Father. And that's a deepening of our connection with Christ. And it's all about the Father. It's not about us. And it's not about what they may say if you don't do it. It's about you growing in conformity to the image of His Son. Moves us to the next ring, rung three. We become more teachable. Some of that, of course, I think is wrought in the school of hard knocks. But we learn that we have these limitations and we don't know everything. It seems like the older you get, you realize how little you did know. And you're willing to listen to both others and even yourself and say, am I making sense here? So that's another characteristic along the ladder. Rung 4. You begin to see that there but by the grace of God were you. And what I mean by that is you will see people that haven't climbed the ladder as far as you have, and you realize how difficult it was down lower on the ladder, and you lovingly would offer a hand to pull them up, but you understand that you were once exactly where they were, struggling with certain things. And so there's no arrogance there. It becomes more of a humble, how can I serve you person that is not as wise as I am, without flaunting it in front of them. So that's rung 4. Rung 5 is there is this radical honesty to others about our weaknesses and faults. You readily acknowledge mistakes that you've made. You wear, as I like to say, you wear the hat of responsibility. You take personal responsibility, and you also don't pretend to know everything. You're a leader in your congregation, and it's okay to say, that's a good question about such and such, one of the minor prophets. I don't know the answer. I'll get back with you. That doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're wise. I would much rather not give them an answer than give them the wrong one. Or as my father used to say, son, it's better to let them think you're a fool than open your mouth and remove any doubt. And so that's rung 5 of the ladder. Rung 6. There's a deepening awareness of being the chief of sinners. When you see others sinning, even sinning against you, you realize that by the grace of God, you're worse than they ever were or ever will be. And that's a deep, deep humility. That's a deep understanding of your adequacy comes from Jesus Christ and what he's done on the cross, not on what you've done in your small efforts here in the short time frame that you've occupied this earth. Brings us to rung 7. You speak less. You don't have the desire, the compulsion to tell everything you know all the time. You listen. You speak less. As Bonhoeffer said, listening is an act of love. And so you're very loving that way. But so you don't have to tell everything you know. And then rung 8, if you speak less, I would say this one, transform it into the love of God. I would say you love more. You speak less, you love more. So those are the rungs of the ladder of humility. Now, what can we say to summarize this brief lesson? Well, first, limits, although painful, are a gift of God. They're not stressors, they're trials. You stand there at a fork in the road, and God is asking you, do you trust me? And as you grow, you learn to accept those limits and say, yes, Lord. And you take the right fork. Limits also remind us that God's God and we're not. And so that's very helpful in understanding our place in the creation and in the universe. Third, limits, if properly grieved, they will cultivate a deepening humility. And you see, growth in spiritual maturity is contingent upon our accepting of these limitations. And to accept our own limitations helps us better accept the limitations of others. Well, I hope that was helpful. And like I said, I want to remind you again that there will be a quiz on Sakai that you'll need to take. Limited time frame, check in the course management system. If you have any questions, please feel free to call me or email me, preferably email me first, or see me in class. God bless.